Some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep we dig their graves. They wait beneath the surface of our careful lives, patient as the earth itself, until the right moment arrives to crack our world wide open. For 72-year-old Elias, a gentle Amish widower, that moment comes on what should have been an ordinary morning walk through the woodlands he's known since childhood. While caring for 3-year-old Lyddie, his neighbor's spirited daughter, he discovers something that shouldn't exist in their peaceful corner of Pennsylvania: a rusted helicopter, swallowed by decades of vine and forest growth. Inside the cockpit, they find a pilot's journal and a small locket that little Lyddie immediately claims as her treasure. But when Elias opens that weathered journal and sees his younger brother's handwriting, his carefully ordered world begins to crumble. The brother who abandoned their family 40 years ago, the brother he'd spent a lifetime trying to forget, had been closer to home than anyone ever imagined. What really happened to Samuel all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania hills like a prayer shawl. Soft and reverent in the early light, Elias Stoltzfus stood at his kitchen window, weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching the sun paint golden streaks across his 40-acre farm. At 72, his beard had turned the color of fresh snow, but his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, remained sharp and kind. The wrinkles etched deep around them spoke of decades spent squinting into summer sun and bitter wind, of laughter shared with his beloved Ruth before the Lord called her home 3 winters past. The silence of his house pressed against him like a familiar ache. Ruth's absence echoed in every corner, in the way he still set 2 places at breakfast before catching himself, in the untouched sewing basket by her favorite chair, in the way he unconsciously saved the best parts of his day to share with someone who would never again be there to listen. Yet this morning felt different somehow, charged with an anticipation he couldn't name. A gentle knock at his door broke the reverie. Through the glass, he saw Martha Yoder standing on his porch, her 3-year-old daughter Lyddie tugging at her black apron with restless energy. Martha's face bore the pallor of someone fighting illness, her usually bright eyes dulled with fatigue. "Elias," Martha said as he opened the door, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hate to ask again, but—" "No need to ask," Elias interrupted gently, already reaching for his hat. "You know Lyddie and I understand each other perfectly well." Lyddie broke free from her mother's grip and launched herself at Elias's legs with the unbridled enthusiasm only a 3-year-old could muster. Her cornflower blue eyes sparkled with mischief, blonde curls escaping from beneath her tiny prayer covering. She reminded him powerfully of his own daughter at that age, Sarah, now grown and married with children of her own in Ohio. "Gross Dawdy Elias," Lyddie squealed, using the Pennsylvania Dutch term for grandfather, though they shared no blood relation. "Can we see the horses? Can we pick berries? Can we—" "Easy there, little bird," Elias chuckled, his large hands gently steadying her bouncing form. "The day is long and we have time for everything." Martha's relief was palpable. "The fever came back during the night," she confessed, swaying slightly on her feet. "Doctor says I need complete rest if this medicine is going to work." "Then you go rest," Elias said firmly. "Lyddie will be safe with me. We have grand adventures planned, don't we, little one?" Lyddie nodded so vigorously her prayer covering slipped sideways. "We're going to explore the whole wide world." After Martha departed with grateful tears in her eyes, Elias found himself studying the child who had become such an unexpected blessing in his quiet life. Since Martha's illness began 2 months ago, Lyddie had spent most days with him, and he'd discovered that caring for her filled some hollow space in his chest he hadn't even realized existed. She was fearless in the way only small children could be, approaching each day as if it held infinite possibilities. "Where shall we go today, Lyddie?" he asked, settling his worn straw hat more firmly on his head. "To the secret places." she declared, pointing toward the woodland that bordered his property. "The places where stories hide." Elias smiled at her turn of phrase. Lyddie had developed an elaborate fantasy life around his farm, convinced that every copse of trees and hidden valley contained magical secrets waiting to be discovered. Her imagination reminded him painfully of another child who had once filled these same woods with wonder, his younger brother, Samuel, lost to them for 40 years now. Samuel. Even thinking the name sent a familiar twist of pain through his chest. They had been close once, despite their 12-year age difference. Samuel had been the dreamer, the questioner, the one who chafed against the boundaries of their plain life. While Elias had found peace in the rhythm of farm work and community worship, Samuel had always been looking beyond the horizon, hungry for something their simple world couldn't provide. The day Samuel left, October 15th, 1985, a date burned into Elias's memory. He had been just 18, barely a man, but certain he knew everything. The argument still echoed in Elias's mind after all these years. Harsh words spoken in anger that could never be taken back. "You'll never understand," Samuel had shouted, his young face flushed with fury and frustration. "You're content to live in a cage, but I won't spend my life trapped by rules made by dead men. This family, this community, it's not a cage, Samuel. It's a foundation," Elias had replied, trying to keep his voice calm even as his heart broke. "Without it, you're just free," Samuel had interrupted. "I'll be free." Those had been the last words they'd exchanged. Samuel had left that very night, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and their father's old Bible, an irony that still stung. The community had waited, as they always did when young people went through their Rumspringer, expecting him to return when the world proved harsher than he'd imagined. But months turned to years, and years to decades, and Samuel never came home. Their parents had carried the grief to their graves, never quite recovering from the loss of their youngest son. Elias had tried to fill the void, working twice as hard, attending every church service, being the perfect son for parents who smiled but never quite stopped listening, for footsteps that would never come. "Gross Dordy Elias. You look sad," Lyddie observed with the startling directness of children. She had positioned herself directly in front of him, her small hands reaching up to touch his face. "Just remembering, little bird," he said softly, lifting her into his arms. "Sometimes old memories visit us whether we invite them or not. Are they good memories or sad memories?" The question stopped him short. How could he explain to a 3-year-old the complicated tangle of love and loss, anger and forgiveness that defined his relationship with Samuel's memory? "Both," he said finally. "The best memories usually are." Lyddie seemed to accept this wisdom with the gravity of someone 3 times her age. "Mama says memories are like flowers in our hearts. Even when they're wilted, they're still beautiful." Martha's words, spoken through her daughter's innocent lips, hit him with unexpected force. Perhaps that was what he needed to learn, how to see beauty in the wilted flowers of his past, rather than focusing only on their decay. "Your mama is very wise," he said, settling Lyddie more securely in his arms. "Now shall we go explore those secret places you mentioned?" The woodland that bordered Elias's property had been part of the Stoltzfus family land for 5 generations. His great-grandfather had left it untouched, believing that every farm needed a piece of wild land to remind them of God's original creation. Over the decades it had become a refuge for deer, rabbits, countless birds, and one old Amish man who found peace in its shadows. Elias had carved subtle paths through the underbrush over the years, not the obvious trails that tourists or developers might follow, but barely visible tracks that required knowledge and attention to navigate. Today, he chose the route that led toward the eastern edge of the property. Where a small creek meandered through stands of ancient oak and maple, Lyddie rode on his shoulders, her tiny hands gripping his hat for balance, chattering constantly about everything she observed. Her running commentary on the natural world around them. "Look, a butterfly wearing a yellow dress. That tree is older than God. The creek is singing a sleepy song," reminded him powerfully of Samuel at that age, full of wonder and questions. "Tell me about when you were little." "Gruzzardi," Lyddie requested as they paused beside the creek. "Well," Elias began, settling onto a fallen log while Lyddie waded in the shallow water, her shoes and stockings abandoned on the bank. "When I was about your age, I had a little brother named Samuel. He was very much like you, always asking questions, always looking for adventures. Where is he now?" The innocent question pierced him like a thorn. "He went away when he grew up," Elias said carefully. "Sometimes people have to find their own paths, even when it takes them far from home. But don't they get lonely?" "I imagine they do, little bird. I imagine they do." They continued deeper into the woods, following the creek as it wound between moss-covered boulders and beneath low-hanging branches. This was the farthest Elias had ventured into this section of woodland in years. Usually, he kept to the well-worn paths closer to the house. But something about Lyddie's presence made him feel adventurous, willing to explore forgotten corners of his own land. The creek made a sharp bend around a massive oak tree, and beyond it the forest seemed to thicken and grow wilder. Elias paused, studying the terrain ahead. Something felt different here, though he couldn't immediately identify what had changed. The quality of light, perhaps, or the way the usual forest sounds seemed muffled and distant. "What's that?" Lyddie pointed ahead, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if she too sensed something unusual. Elias followed her gaze and froze. Through the tangle of vines and undergrowth, he could make out something that definitely didn't belong in these ancient woods, straight lines and metallic glints that spoke of human machinery rather than natural growth. His heart began to beat faster as they approached, Lyddie's small hand gripping his with sudden uncertainty. What they had discovered defied all logic and explanation. An aircraft of some kind, so thoroughly overgrown with vines and moss that it seemed to have been claimed by the forest itself. "Is it an airplane, Grossdordy?" Lyddie whispered, her earlier bravado replaced by appropriate awe. "A helicopter," Elias corrected automatically, though his mind was reeling. How long had this thing been here? How had it come to rest in the heart of his family's woodland without anyone knowing? And why did something about its presence fill him with a dread he couldn't name? The aircraft was old, that much was clear. Rust had eaten through much of its metal skin, and what paint remained was faded beyond recognition. Vines had grown through broken windows, and moss covered the rotor blades like a thick green shroud. Nature had been patient but thorough in its reclamation project. "Can we look inside?" Lyddie asked, her curiosity overcoming her initial fear. Every instinct told Elias to turn around, to take Lyddie home and pretend they had never made this discovery. But something stronger than instinct, a pull he couldn't resist, drew him toward the wreckage. Perhaps it was the same force that had led them to this exact spot on this particular morning, as if the helicopter had been waiting all these years for someone to find it. The pilot's door hung open, its hinges long since rusted into submission. Elias helped Lyddie climb up onto the metal step, supporting her as she peered into the cockpit with wide eyes. The interior was remarkably well preserved, protected from the worst of the weather by the aircraft's metal shell. And there, still strapped into the pilot's seat by a seatbelt that had somehow survived decades of decay, was a leather journal. Elias's hands trembled as he reached for the journal, his weathered fingers hesitating just inches from the cracked leather cover. The morning air seemed to hold its breath around them, as if the forest itself understood the magnitude of this moment. Lyddie pressed closer against his side, her small body radiating warmth and innocent curiosity. "It looks old, Grossdordy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant murmur of the creek. "Like the treasure maps in my storybooks." The leather was surprisingly supple despite its age, worn smooth by countless hands. Hands that Elias realized with growing certainty he had once known as well as his own. His heart hammered against his ribs as he carefully opened the cover, praying silently that his suspicions would prove wrong, even as a deeper part of him knew they wouldn't. The first page bore an inscription in faded blue ink, written in a familiar slanted script that sent shockwaves through his entire being. "Property of Samuel Stoltzfus, October 1985. If found, please return to family in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The journal slipped from Elias's nerveless fingers, landing with a soft thud on the helicopter's metal floor. The sound seemed to echo through his chest, reverberating like a bell tolling for something precious that had been lost long ago. 40 years of carefully constructed assumptions, of wondering and waiting and finally accepting, crumbled in an instant. "Gross Dawdy?" Lyddie's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you sick? You look like Mama when she has the fever." Elias forced himself to breathe, each inhalation feeling like he was drowning in reverse. Samuel had been here, not just passing through on some grand adventure, but here, so close to home, that Elias could have walked to this spot on any given day for the past 4 decades. The brother he had mourned as lost to the world had been resting in eternal silence just beyond the familiar boundaries of the family land. With shaking hands, he retrieved the journal and flipped through its pages. Samuel's handwriting filled nearly every line, documenting what appeared to be some kind of covert operation. The entries began in late 1985, just months after Samuel had stormed out of their family home. His young face twisted with anger and determination. November 15th, 1985. Training complete. They say I'm a natural pilot, that I have instincts that can't be taught. Maybe leaving home was the right choice after all. At least here, people see what I can do instead of what I'm supposed to be. December 3rd, 1985. First real mission tomorrow. Can't write details, but it's important work. Government work. The kind that makes a difference in the world. I think about home sometimes. Wonder if Elias ever thinks about me. Probably better that he doesn't. Elias's vision blurred as he read his brother's words. Even in his anger and rebellion, Samuel had been thinking of him. The realization hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his chest ache with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. "There's something shiny," Lyddie announced, her attention already moving past the mysterious journal to explore other treasures hidden in the cockpit. She had spotted something wedged beneath the passenger seat, a small object that caught and reflected the filtered sunlight streaming through the broken canopy. Elias watched numbly as she squeezed her tiny body into the cramped space, her determination to retrieve the object both endearing and heartbreaking. When she emerged, triumphant and slightly dusty, she held a delicate silver locket in her palm. "Look, Gross Dawdy. It's beautiful." She held it up so it spun slowly in the morning light, its surface engraved with an intricate pattern of roses and vines. "Can I keep it, please? It wants to be my special treasure." The locket looked expensive, far beyond anything Samuel could have afforded on his own. Elias accepted it from Lyddie's eager hands, noting its substantial weight and the quality of its craftsmanship. Inside, he discovered a small photograph, a young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, someone he had never seen before, but who looked at the camera with unmistakable love. On the opposite side of the locket, an inscription in elegant script read, "To my darling Samuel, all my love, Maria, December 24th, 1987. Maria." Samuel had found love, had been loved in return. The discovery should have brought comfort, but instead it deepened Elias's anguish. His brother had built a life, had found someone to share his dreams and adventures, and Elias had known nothing about it. They had been strangers to each other in the most complete sense, separated by pride and stubborn principles that now seemed painfully insignificant. "She's pretty," Lyddie observed, studying the photograph with the solemn appreciation of someone evaluating fine art. "She looks like she tells good stories." "Yes," Elias managed, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I imagine she did." He turned back to the journal with desperate urgency, needing to understand what had happened, how Samuel's story had ended in this overgrown wreckage so close to home. The entries grew increasingly sporadic as the months passed, but the missions Samuel described seemed to grow more dangerous. March 12th, 1987. Close call today. Engine trouble over hostile territory. Made it back, but barely. starting to wonder if this life is sustainable. Maria keeps asking when I'm going to introduce her to my family. How do I explain that I burned those bridges so thoroughly there's no way back? August 20th, 1987, proposed to Maria last night. She said yes, thank God. Maybe it's time to think about settling down, finding something safer. She deserves better than a man who might not come home one day. October 15th, 1988, 3 years since I left home. I dream about the farm sometimes, about Elias working in the fields. Wonder if he ever forgives people, or if some mistakes are too big to fix. The entries became increasingly introspective, filled with regret and longing that mirrored Elias's own feelings during those same years. Samuel had been homesick, had wanted to return, but couldn't find a way to bridge the gap his pride had created. The knowledge was almost unbearable. "Gross Dordie, why are you crying?" Lyddie had climbed down from the helicopter and was standing beside him, her small face creased with concern. Her innocent question broke through his emotional paralysis like a stone through glass. Because sometimes we discover that people we love were hurting, and we didn't know how to help them, he said, kneeling down to her level. The locket chain slipped over her head as he spoke, the silver pendant resting against her small chest like a blessing. "But we can help them now, can't we?" she asked, with the absolute faith that only children possessed. "We can tell them we love them and make the hurt go away. If only it were that simple. If only love could reach across the years and heal wounds that had been left to fester in silence." But Samuel was beyond help now, beyond forgiveness and reconciliation and all the conversations they should have had. The final entries in the journal were dated from early 1989, and they told a story that chilled Elias to his core. Samuel had been flying reconnaissance missions over Central America, gathering intelligence for operations that officially didn't exist. The work was dangerous, the aircraft old and poorly maintained, but the pay was good, and Samuel had been planning to use the money to buy a house for himself and Maria. February 14th, 1989, Valentine's Day mission. Appropriate, considering I'm risking my life for love. "One more job," Maria says, "and then we're done." She's right. Time to find a life that doesn't require risking death on a regular basis. That was the last entry. Whatever had happened after that Valentine's Day, Samuel had never had the chance to write about it. The helicopter in which they sat had become his final resting place. His dreams of home and love and redemption buried beneath decades of Pennsylvania forest growth. Elias closed the journal and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of 40 years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. Samuel had been thinking of home, had been planning to return, and Elias had spent all those years believing his brother had simply forgotten them. "Are we going to tell Mama about the treasure?" Lyddie asked, the locket glinting against her dark dress as she moved. "Yes," Elias said, though he wasn't sure how he would ever find words for what they had discovered. "We'll tell her everything, but first, he needed time to process this devastating revelation, to figure out how to carry the knowledge that his brother had died so close to home, carrying regrets that matched Elias's own. The careful peace he had built around Samuel's memory lay in ruins. Replaced by a grief so fresh and raw, it felt like losing his brother all over again. The walk back to the farmhouse passed in a haze of emotional turmoil that Elias struggled to contain. Lyddie chattered beside him, the silver locket bouncing against her chest with each animated gesture, completely oblivious to the earthquake that had just reshaped her companion's understanding of his own life. Her innocent joy in their discovery stood in stark contrast to the devastation coursing through Elias's heart. "We found the best treasure ever, didn't we, Gross Dordie?" she said, skipping alongside him as they emerged from the woodland into the familiar comfort of his pastures. "Wait until I tell Mama about the flying machine and the pretty lady in the picture." "Yes, little bird," Elias managed, his voice sounding strange and distant even to his own ears. "We certainly did find something extraordinary. But how could he explain to a 3-year-old that their discovery represented one of the greatest tragedies of his life? How could he tell her that the locket she wore so proudly was a remnant of dreams that had died before they could come to fruition? Of a love story cut short by circumstances neither he nor Samuel had fully understood at the time. The farmhouse came into view, its white walls and neat gardens, a testament to decades of careful tending. Elias had always found peace in the sight of his home, but today even its familiar comfort couldn't penetrate the fog of grief and regret that surrounded him. Samuel's journal felt heavy in his pocket, weighted with revelations that changed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. As they approached the back porch, Elias noticed a buggy tied up near the barn, Bishop Weaver's distinctive black carriage with its well-maintained leather traces. His heart sank. The last thing he needed today was to navigate a social visit while his emotions were in such chaos, but refusing to see the bishop would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. "Company!" Lyddie announced with delight, always pleased by unexpected visitors. She ran ahead toward the house, her small legs carrying her with impressive speed. Bishop Weaver emerged from the kitchen as they approached, his lined face creased with the gentle concern that had made him beloved in their community for over 30 years. At 68, he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime bearing the spiritual burdens of others, yet his eyes remained sharp and kind. "Elias, my friend," the bishop said warmly, extending his hand in greeting. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was visiting the Yoder family down the road and thought I'd stop by to see how you're managing." The timing felt like divine intervention of the cruelest sort. Elias shook the bishop's hand, acutely aware of Samuel's journal pressing against his leg through his pocket. How many times over the years had Bishop Weaver gently inquired about Samuel, offering prayers and hope for the prodigal son's return? How many Sunday services had included subtle references to lost sheep finding their way home? "Of course not," Elias replied, hoping his voice sounded more normal than it felt. "You're always welcome here. Can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be lovely," Bishop Weaver accepted, his eyes moving curiously to Lyddie, who was practically vibrating with excitement beside them. "And who is this young lady? I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "This is Lyddie Yoder," Elias explained, grateful for the distraction. "I've been watching her while her mother recovers from her illness." "Ah, yes. Martha mentioned you've been a tremendous help to their family." The bishop smiled down at Lyddie with genuine warmth. "And what have you and Elias been up to today, Miss Lyddie?" Lyddie launched into an animated recounting of their morning adventure, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement. She described the helicopter in vivid detail, gesturing wildly as she explained how they had found the treasure book and her special necklace. Throughout her enthusiastic narrative, Elias felt the bishop's attention sharpening, his experienced pastoral instincts clearly detecting undertones he didn't quite understand. "A helicopter, you say?" Bishop Weaver repeated carefully, his eyes moving between Lyddie's animated face and Elias's increasingly tense expression. "That's quite an unusual discovery. How long do you suppose it's been there?" "Hard to say," Elias replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Decades from the look of it. Completely overgrown. And this journal Lyddie mentioned?" The direct question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elias could feel the weight of his community's trust, the decades of shared faith and mutual support that bound them together. Bishop Weaver had been more than a spiritual leader. He had been a friend, a confidant, someone who had helped Elias navigate the darkest periods of his life, including the grief of losing Samuel. But the journal represented something too raw, too complicated to share in this moment. Samuel's story belonged to family first, and Elias needed time to process what he had learned before involving others. "Even someone as trusted as the bishop. Just old papers," he said, hating the evasion, but unable to force more honesty from his constricted throat. "Nothing of importance." Bishop Weaver studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading the human heart. Elias could see questions forming behind his kind eyes, pastoral concern wrestling with respect for privacy. In their community, pushing too hard for information was considered impolite. But genuine care often required gentle persistence. Elias, the bishop said softly, settling into his chair at the kitchen table as Elias poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you quite so unsettled. Are you certain there's nothing troubling you? The compassionate inquiry nearly broke Elias's careful composure. Bishop Weaver had been the one to comfort their family when Samuel left, had offered countless prayers for the young man's safe return, had even subtly inquired within the broader Amish community about any word of Samuel's whereabouts. If anyone deserved to know the truth about Samuel's fate, it was this good man who had shared their burden for so many years, but the knowledge felt too fresh, too overwhelming. Elias needed time to understand it himself before he could bear the weight of explaining it to others, even with the best of intentions. "I'm fine," he insisted, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Just tired, perhaps. Caring for a young one takes more energy than it used to." Lyddie, meanwhile, had discovered a box of colored pencils that Elias kept for her visits and was busy drawing pictures at the kitchen table. Her artwork typically featured fantastical creatures and elaborate castles, but today she was methodically sketching what appeared to be the helicopter, complete with detailed vine coverage and a stick-figure representation of herself wearing the locket. "That's quite an artistic interpretation," Bishop Weaver observed, leaning over to admire her work. "You have a good memory for details, Miss Lyddie." "I remember everything important," she declared with the absolute confidence of childhood. "Gross Dodi says memories are like flowers in our hearts, and I want to keep all the pretty ones." The bishop's eyebrows rose slightly at this philosophical declaration from someone barely old enough to tie her own shoes. His gaze moved to Elias with renewed interest, clearly recognizing that something significant had occurred during their morning expedition. "Even if he couldn't identify exactly what, that's very wise advice," he said carefully. "And it sounds like you and Elias shared quite an adventure today, the best adventure ever," Lyddie confirmed, holding up her drawing for their inspection. "And tomorrow we're going to go back and explore more." The casual announcement sent a spike of panic through Elias's chest. The idea of returning to that place, of confronting Samuel's final resting place again, felt unbearable. Yet he also knew that Lyddie's innocent. Enthusiasm would be difficult to redirect without explanations. He wasn't prepared to give after Bishop Weaver departed with promises to check on Martha's health and gentle reminders that Elias shouldn't hesitate to reach out if he needed anything. The farmhouse settled into an uneasy quiet. Lyddie had fallen asleep on the living room sofa, exhausted by the morning's excitement, the silver locket rising and falling gently with each breath. Elias found himself standing at his kitchen window again, staring out at the woodland, where Samuel's secrets lay buried beneath decades of growth. The journal called to him from where he'd placed it on the kitchen counter, its worn leather cover seeming to pulse with unread revelations. Every rational part of his mind urged caution. Some knowledge, once gained, could never be unknown, but the need to understand his brother's final years overwhelmed his hesitation. With trembling fingers, he opened to where he'd left off reading, and Samuel's familiar handwriting drew him deeper into a world he'd never imagined his gentle brother inhabiting. March 3rd, 1989. Maria's getting suspicious about the missions. Can't blame her. I've been gone 3 weeks out of the last month, and I can't tell her where or why. She deserves better than secrets and half-truths. Found myself looking at maps of Pennsylvania yesterday, tracing the roads that lead home. 15 minutes by air from Lancaster County. So close I could practically walk there if I had to. The entry hit Elias like a physical blow. 15 minutes. Samuel had been measuring the distance home in flying time. So close that on clear days he might have been able to see the familiar landmarks of their childhood from whatever airfield he was using. The realization that his brother had been homesick, had been planning some kind of return, made the tragedy of his death almost unbearable. March 15th, 1989. Told Maria about home today. Really told her for the first time. About the farm, about Elias, about the way I left. She cried. Not because she was upset, but because she finally understood why I wake up sometimes calling out for people she's never met. She wants to visit Pennsylvania after we're married. Says families can heal from anything if both sides want it badly enough. God, I hope she's right. Elias had to stop reading, his vision blurred by tears. He'd been fighting since they'd returned from the woods. Maria had been ready to help Samuel come home. She'd been willing to embrace a world completely foreign to her own experience, to become part of a family that had given Samuel up for lost. The generosity of this unknown woman, this Maria whose photograph smiled up from Lyddie's locket, humbled him completely. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reading. Through the glass, he saw Martha Yoder on his porch, looking significantly better than she had that morning, but still pale and unsteady. Her eyes immediately found Lyddie's sleeping form through the window, and her expression softened with maternal relief. "I'm sorry to bother you," Martha said quietly, as Elias opened the door. "I know I said I'd rest all day, but I started worrying. Was she any trouble?" "Never," Elias assured her, though his voice carried more emotion than such a simple question warranted. "She's been perfect company, as always." Martha studied his face with the keen perception of someone who had spent years reading the moods of a 3-year-old. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Elias. Are you feeling all right?" The unintended accuracy of her observation made him flinch. In a very real sense, he had spent the day with Samuel's ghost, walking through memories and regrets that had taken on new weight with each page of the journal. "Just a long day," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "Would you like some coffee before you wake Lyddie?" Martha accepted gratefully, settling into a kitchen chair with the careful movements of someone still recovering from illness. Her eyes immediately went to the journal lying open on the counter, then to Elias's troubled expression. "That's an interesting old book," she observed carefully. "It looks well-traveled." Elias realized he'd left Samuel's journal exposed, its pages open to entries that revealed far more than he was ready to share. Quickly, he closed the cover and moved it to a less prominent position. But Martha's curiosity had clearly been piqued. "We found it during our walk today," he said, the partial truth feeling like betrayal on his tongue. "In the woods, along with some other old things." Lyddie mentioned something about a helicopter and a special necklace, Martha said, her tone carefully neutral. She seemed quite excited about both. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lyddie stirred on the sofa and sat up, her hair disheveled and the locket glinting against her dark dress. When she spotted her mother, her face lit up with pure joy. "Mama, you look better. Wait until you see what we found." She scrambled off the sofa and ran to her mother, launching into an animated retelling of their discovery. Her version of events was even more enthusiastic than the one she'd shared with Bishop Weaver. Complete with dramatic gestures and sound effects, Martha listened with growing amazement, her eyes moving frequently to Elias's increasingly uncomfortable expression. When Lyddie finished her tale by proudly displaying the locket, Martha's maternal instincts clearly shifted into high alert. "Lyddie, sweetheart," she said gently, "this is very beautiful, but it belongs to someone else. We can't just keep things we find, even if they're pretty. But Grossdordy said I could have it." Lyddie protested, her small hands protectively covering the locket. "He said it wanted to be my special treasure." Martha's questioning gaze moved to Elias, who found himself trapped between a 3-year-old's innocent attachment and an adult's reasonable concern about property ownership. How could he explain that the locket's original owner was beyond caring about earthly possessions? That Samuel would probably have been delighted to know his treasured memento had found its way to someone who appreciated its beauty. "The helicopter has been there for many years," Elias said carefully. "Whoever left these things behind isn't coming back for them." "How can you be certain?" Martha asked, her practical nature asserting itself. Shouldn't we report the discovery to the authorities? If someone crashed on your property, there might be family members who never knew what happened. The suggestion sent cold dread through Elias's chest. Official investigations would mean questions he couldn't answer without revealing Samuel's identity. It would mean strangers trampling through the woodland, disturbing what had become his brother's gravesite, turning a private family tragedy into public spectacle. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, hearing the strain in his own voice. "The aircraft is very old." "Any official inquiry would have happened decades ago," Martha frowned, clearly unconvinced by his reasoning. "But still, if there's any chance that someone's family has been wondering—" "Mama," Lyddie interrupted, sensing tension she didn't understand, but instinctively wanting to redirect the conversation. "Look what else we found!" She ran to retrieve her drawing from the table, proudly displaying her artistic interpretation of the helicopter discovery. The drawing was remarkably detailed for a 3-year-old's work, showing not just the basic shape of the aircraft, but also the vine coverage, the open cockpit door, and even tiny representations of the journal and locket. At the bottom of the page, she had carefully written her name in uneven letters, along with the date and the words, "My best adventure." Martha studied the drawing with growing concern, clearly recognizing that Lyddie's depiction suggested a much more significant discovery than she'd initially understood. The helicopter in the drawing looked substantial, real, the kind of find that would indeed warrant official attention. "Elias," she said quietly, a voice carrying the weight of community responsibility, "I think we need to talk about this more seriously." The weight of Martha's expectation hung heavy in the kitchen air as Elias struggled to find words that would satisfy her legitimate concerns without revealing the devastating truth he wasn't ready to share. Lyddie continued to clutch her drawing, oblivious to the adult tension swirling around her treasured discovery. But her innocent presence somehow made the conversation even more difficult. "Martha," Elias began, his voice carefully measured, "I understand your concerns, but I think we need to consider all the implications before involving outsiders." Implications. Martha's eyebrows rose with the sharpness of someone who had spent years navigating the practical realities of raising a child alone. "Elias, we're talking about a crashed aircraft. There could be safety issues, fuel contamination, structural dangers. And if someone died in that crash—" "No one died in the crash," Elias interrupted, the words escaping before he could stop them. The moment they left his lips, he realized his mistake. How could he possibly know that unless he knew far more about the helicopter's history than he'd admitted? Martha stared at him with growing suspicion. "How can you be certain of that? Did you find something in that journal that you haven't mentioned?" Lyddie looked back and forth between the two adults, her young mind picking up on the tension, even if she couldn't understand its source. She moved closer to Elias, her small hand slipping into his much larger one, offering the unconscious comfort that children provided simply by their presence. "Grossdordy knows lots of things," she said loyally, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "He told me stories about his little brother who went away. Maybe he knows about the flying machine too." The innocent connection Lyddie drew between Samuel's story and their discovery sent another spike of panic through Elias's chest. Children had an uncanny ability to perceive patterns that adults missed, and he couldn't afford to have her making connections that might lead to questions he couldn't answer. "That's different, little bird," he said gently, squeezing her hand. "Those are old family stories. This is just—" He struggled to find words that wouldn't be outright lies. "This is just something that happened a long time ago." "But the book has words in it," Lyddie persisted with the relentless logic of childhood. "Words tell stories. Is it a story about your little brother?" Martha's attention sharpened like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "What exactly did you find in that journal, Elias? And please don't tell me it was just old papers. I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you this shaken by anything." The direct challenge left Elias feeling cornered. trapped between his desperate need for privacy and the legitimate concerns of a friend who had every right to expect honesty. The journal lay on the counter between them, like evidence at a trial, its leather cover holding secrets that could change everything if revealed too soon. "It's personal," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Family business that needs to be handled within the family." "Family business?" Martha's voice rose with incredulity. "Elias, your closest family is your daughter Sarah in Ohio, and she hasn't been here in months. If this involves family, shouldn't she be informed immediately?" The mention of Sarah sent a new wave of anxiety through Elias's already overwhelmed emotional state. His daughter would indeed need to know about Samuel eventually, but the thought of trying to explain 40 years of silence and misunderstanding over a telephone felt impossible. Sarah had never even met Samuel. He'd left when she was just a baby. How could he make her understand the complicated web of love and loss that defined their family's relationship with the brother who'd vanished? "I'll call Sarah when the time is right," he said, hoping Martha would accept this compromise. But Martha's practical nature, honed by years of making difficult decisions as a single mother, wouldn't be satisfied with vague promises. "Elias, I care about you and respect your privacy, but we're talking about potential legal and safety issues. If that helicopter has been on your property for decades without anyone knowing about it, there could be environmental concerns, property complications." "There are no complications," Elias interrupted, his voice carrying more edge than he'd intended. "The aircraft isn't causing any harm to anyone. It's been sitting there peacefully for years, claimed by the forest." "Why disturb that now?" The sharpness of his tone made Lyddie flinch, and he immediately regretted letting his desperation show so clearly. Children were sensitive to adult emotions, and the last thing he wanted was to frighten her or associate negative feelings with what had been. "For her, a wonderful adventure. I'm sorry. Little bird," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. "I didn't mean to sound upset. Sometimes grown-ups have to discuss complicated things, and it makes us worry." Lyddie studied his face with the serious expression she wore when trying to understand adult mysteries. "Are you worried about the pretty lady in the picture? Is she lost too?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In all his focus on Samuel's fate, he'd barely considered what had happened to Maria, the woman who had loved his brother enough to want to meet his family, who had encouraged Samuel's dreams of reconciliation, who had probably spent the last 36 years wondering what had become of the man she'd planned to marry. "I don't know, a sweetheart," he admitted, the honesty feeling like another small betrayal. "I hope she found happiness wherever she is." Martha watched this exchange with growing concern, clearly recognizing that Elias was dealing with something far more significant than he'd admitted. Her maternal instincts, already heightened by her own recent illness and vulnerability, shifted into protective mode. "Elias," she said quietly, moving to stand beside his chair, "whatever you found in that journal has obviously upset you deeply. You don't have to handle this alone. Our community exists to support each other through difficult times." The gentle offer of support nearly broke his carefully maintained composure. Martha was right. Their Amish community had weathered countless crises together, sharing burdens and finding strength in collective faith. But Samuel's story felt too complicated, too tangled with decades of judgment and misunderstanding to trust to community wisdom just yet. "I need time," he said simply. "Time to understand what we found, time to figure out how to handle it properly." "Can you give me that?" Martha hesitated, clearly torn between respect for his wishes and her own sense of responsibility. Finally, she nodded reluctantly. "A few days," she agreed. "But Elias, if this involves potential danger to the community, or if there are legal issues that need to be addressed—" "There aren't," he assured her, though the promise felt hollow even as he spoke it. How could he know what complications Samuel's covert government work might have created? What if there were people still looking for answers about missing pilots and failed missions? "And the locket?" Martha asked, glancing at Lyddie, who was still wearing the silver pendant like a badge of honor. "I'm still not comfortable with her keeping something that belongs to someone else." Elias looked at the child who had brought such unexpected joy into his grieving life, at the way the locket caught the afternoon light and seemed to bring out the brightness in her eyes. Samuel would have loved Lyddie's spirit, her fearless curiosity and generous heart. Perhaps letting her keep Maria's gift was a way of honoring both their memories. "It belongs to her now," he said with quiet conviction. Sometimes treasures find their way to exactly the people who need them most. That evening, after Martha had reluctantly departed with Lyddie, who had insisted on wearing the locket to bed, Elias found himself alone with Samuel's journal and the crushing weight of knowledge he wasn't sure how to bear. The farmhouse felt different now, as if Samuel's ghost had taken up residence in its familiar corners, whispering questions that had no comfortable answers. He settled into his favorite armchair, the one Ruth had insisted they buy for his 60th birthday, despite his protests about the expense, and opened the journal to where he'd left off. The late afternoon light slanted through his windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness growing in his heart with each revelation. April 2nd, 1989. Can't stop thinking about home. Yesterday, I flew over a farm that looked just like ours from the air. Same layout, same creek running through the back pasture. For a moment, I forgot where I was and started looking for Elias working in the fields. Maria says I called out his name in my sleep again. She's worried about me, and she should be. This work is changing me in ways I don't like. The entry made Elias's chest tighten with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. Samuel had been dreaming about home, calling out for the brother he'd left behind in anger. All those years of silence, and they'd been thinking about each other across the void of pride and stubborn misunderstanding. April 15th, 1989. Made a decision today. After this next mission, I'm done. Maria and I are going to buy that little house outside Lancaster, the one with the garden she's been talking about. And then I'm going home to face whatever music needs to be faced. Maybe Elias won't forgive me, but I have to try. A man can't outrun his family forever. Elias had to stop reading, his vision blurred by tears that had been building all day. Samuel had been planning to come home, not just passing through or sending a letter, but actually returning to make amends for the harsh words that had driven him away 4 decades ago. The knowledge was almost unbearable, so close to reconciliation, so close to healing, and yet prevented by circumstances neither of them could have foreseen. A soft knock at his door interrupted his reading. Through the window, he could see the familiar silhouette of his neighbor, Jacob Miller, holding a covered dish that probably contained his wife's famous pot roast. Jacob was one of the few people in their community who visited regularly since Ruth's death, understanding that grief could be a lonely companion. "Evening, Elias," Jacob said warmly as the door opened. "Rebecca thought you might appreciate some supper, especially with all the extra work of watching little Lyddie." "That's very kind of her," Elias replied, accepting the dish gratefully. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Jacob's weathered face brightened with acceptance. At 65, he was still one of the most energetic men in their district, known for his skill with horses and his ability to fix anything mechanical. His presence usually brought comfort, but tonight Elias felt the weight of secrets creating distance between them. "Heard you had quite an adventure with young Lyddie today," Jacob said, settling into the kitchen chair that had become the unofficial visitor's seat over the years. "She was telling my grandson all about finding some kind of aircraft in your woods." The casual mention of Lyddie's storytelling sent a spike of anxiety through Elias's already frayed nerves. Children's stories had a way of spreading through their close-knit community like ripples in a pond, growing and changing with each retelling until they bore only passing resemblance to the original truth. "You know how children are," Elias said carefully, busying himself with coffee preparation to avoid Jacob's keen gaze. "Everything becomes an adventure in their imagination." "True enough," Jacob agreed, but his tone carried a note of curiosity that suggested he'd heard more than just a child's fantasy tale. Though my grandson seemed quite impressed by her description of the helicopter, said she drew him a picture with remarkable detail for someone making things up. The mention of more drawings made Elias's heart sink. Lyddie's artistic documentation of their discovery was spreading beyond his ability to control, creating a trail of evidence that pointed toward questions he couldn't answer without revealing Samuel's identity. "She's very creative," he managed, though the words felt inadequate. Jacob studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone who had known him for 30 years. "Elias, you look like a man carrying a heavy burden. Is everything all right?" The direct question hung between them like a challenge. Jacob had been one of Samuel's admirers when he was young, often commenting on the boy's intelligence and curiosity. He'd also been part of the community that had waited hopefully for Samuel's return, offering prayers and keeping faith that the prodigal son would eventually find his way home. "Just tired," Elias said. The same evasion he'd offered Bishop Weaver and Martha. But Jacob's expression suggested he wasn't any more convinced than the others had been. "You know," Jacob said quietly, "I was thinking about Samuel today. Don't know why, just one of those moments when old memories surface without warning. I remembered how he used to ask endless questions about everything, especially mechanical things. He would have been fascinated by finding an old aircraft, would have wanted to take it apart piece by piece to understand how it worked. The unexpected mention of Samuel's name in connection with their discovery felt like a physical blow. Elias struggled to keep his expression neutral while his heart raced with panic. How much had Lyddie's story revealed? How many connections were people beginning to make? "Samuel always was curious about the world beyond our boundaries," Elias said carefully, hoping his voice sounded appropriately nostalgic rather than devastated. "I still pray for him sometimes," Jacob confessed, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Pray that wherever he is, he found what he was looking for. Pray that he knows his family never stopped loving him, even when they couldn't understand his choices." The gentle words hit Elias like hammer blows. Jacob's continued faith in Samuel's eventual return, his assumption that Samuel was still somewhere in the world, living his chosen life, made the truth feel even more tragic. The community had maintained hope for 40 years, never knowing that their prayers for Samuel's safe return had been answered with silence, not because he was stubborn, but because he couldn't come home anymore. "He knows," Elias said quietly, the words carrying more truth than Jacob could possibly understand. "Somehow, I think he knows." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own memories of the young man who had left such a lasting impression on their small community. Finally, Jacob stirred and glanced toward the journal that Elias had inadvertently left visible on the counter. "That's an interesting old book," Jacob observed with the casual interest of someone who appreciated well-crafted objects. "Looks like it's seen some adventures of its own." Elias's blood turned to ice. Samuel's journal lay open to a page filled with his distinctive handwriting, clearly visible to anyone who cared to look closely. He moved quickly to close the cover, but not before Jacob's experienced eyes had noted the careful script and quality paper. "Found it in the woods today," Elias said. The partial truth, feeling more like betrayal with each repetition. "Just old records, nothing important," but Jacob's expression had sharpened with recognition. As someone who had taught school before becoming a full-time farmer, he had a good eye for handwriting and an excellent memory for the writing styles of his former students. "That script looks familiar," he said slowly, his gaze moving between the closed journal and Elias's increasingly tense expression. "Very familiar, in fact. It reminds me of—" "It's getting late," Elias interrupted, standing abruptly and hoping to end the conversation before Jacob could voice whatever connection he was making. "I should let you get home to Rebecca." Jacob rose as well, but his movements were slow and thoughtful, his mind clearly working to place what he'd seen. "Of course," he said politely, though his eyes remained troubled. "Thank you for the coffee. And Elias, if you ever need someone to talk to about anything, you know I'm here." The offer of support, so similar to the ones Bishop Weaver and Martha had made, nearly broke Elias's resolve to handle Samuel's revelation alone. But the fear of community judgment, of having to explain 40 years of silence and misunderstanding, kept him locked in isolation. After Jacob's departure, Elias found himself pacing the farmhouse like a caged animal, Samuel's journal clutched in his trembling hands. The walls that had once provided comfort now felt like they were closing in, trapping him with secrets that grew heavier with each passing hour. He needed air, needed space to think, needed to escape the suffocating weight of 40 years of misunderstanding that had just been shattered. Without fully conscious decision, he found himself walking back toward the woodland, drawn by some inexplicable need to return to the place where his world had changed forever. The evening light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, creating an almost sacred atmosphere among the ancient trees. His feet found the path automatically, muscle memory guiding him through shadows that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over 7 decades of life. The helicopter sat exactly as they'd left it, but somehow it looked different in the gathering dusk, less like a mechanical intrusion and more like a monument to dreams deferred. Elias approached it slowly, reverently, as if he were entering a church where his brother's spirit still lingered among the twisted metal and overgrown vines. He climbed carefully into the cockpit, settling into the seat where Samuel must have spent his final moments. The leather was cracked and faded, but it still bore the impression of a human form, still held the ghost of his brother's presence. With shaking hands, he opened the journal to its final entries, needing to understand how Samuel's story had ended. February 20th, 1989. Something's wrong with this mission. The intelligence doesn't match what we're seeing on the ground, and the aircraft they've given us is older than it should be for this kind of work. Maria begged me not to go, said she had a bad feeling. I should have listened to her. But the money from this job will buy us that house, will give us the fresh start we need. February 22nd, 1989. Engine trouble started during the flight back. Tried to make it to the safe house, but she's losing power fast. Can see Pennsylvania below. Familiar fields and farmhouses that look just like home. If I don't make it, Maria will know I loved her. And maybe somehow Elias will know I was sorry for all the hard words between us. The final entry was smeared, as if Samuel had been writing while the helicopter shook with mechanical failure. But there was more. A loose page tucked between the journal's back cover and binding. Written in different ink, and what appeared to be a different hand entirely. Elias pulled it free with trembling fingers, squinting in the fading light to make out the unfamiliar script. To whoever finds this record, my name is Maria Santos, and I was engaged to marry Samuel Stoltzfus. It is now April 1990, 1 year since Samuel disappeared during what was supposed to be his final mission. The government agencies he worked for have told me nothing, claiming no knowledge of his activities. But I know he was flying reconnaissance missions over Central America, and I know his last assignment was scheduled to end on February 22nd, 1989. I have spent months searching for any trace of him, following every lead, no matter how unlikely. A contact at the airfield told me Samuel's helicopter was seen flying north toward Pennsylvania on the day he vanished. I know he was homesick, know he talked constantly about returning to his family's farm. If he was in trouble, if his aircraft was failing, he might have tried to reach the place he considered home. I have driven every back road in Lancaster County, walked through every accessible woodland, searching for any sign of wreckage. I'm leaving this letter in the helicopter where Samuel and I first met, the aircraft where he taught me to fly, hoping that someday someone will find it and know that Samuel Stoltzfus was loved deeply by someone who would have gladly spent her life, helping him rebuild the bridges he thought he had burned. Forever, if his family ever reads this, please know that Samuel spoke of you constantly. especially of his brother Elias. He carried a photograph of the family farm in his wallet, and he dreamed every night of the day he would have the courage to return home. He was planning to come back to Pennsylvania after we married, hoping to make amends for whatever harsh words had passed between you. Samuel was a good man who made some poor choices, but his heart never left the community that raised him. If Samuel is found, or if anyone learns what happened to him, please contact Maria Santos at the address below. I will wait as long as necessary for answers, because love doesn't end just because someone disappears. The letter was followed by an address in Virginia, written in Maria's careful script, along with a telephone number that was probably long since disconnected. But it was the date at the bottom that made Elias's heart stop completely. April 15th, 1990, exactly 1 year after Samuel was supposed to come home. Maria had searched for him. For months, she had driven the back roads of Lancaster County, walking through woodlands just like this one, looking for any trace of the man she loved. She had been so close, had probably driven past the very road that led to the Stoltzfus farm dozens of times, never knowing that Samuel lay just beyond the tree line, beyond her ability to find him. But there was more. Tucked beneath Maria's letter was another document, this one official-looking with government letterhead. Elias held it up to catch the last rays of sunlight, struggling to make out the formal language. Classified Incident Report, February 22nd, 1989, Aircraft Bell. UH-1H. Registration, N47891, Pilot, Samuel Stoltzfus. Contract Employee Mission Status. Aircraft and pilot failed to return from scheduled reconnaissance mission over Central America. No distress signal received. Search and rescue operations terminated after 72 hours with no contact or wreckage located. Official determination: pilot and aircraft presumed lost over international waters. Next of kin notification: negative. Personnel file indicates subject estranged from family, no emergency contacts on record. Case status: closed. The bureaucratic language hit Elias like physical blows. Samuel had been declared officially dead. His case closed. His family never notified because the government had no record of anyone who cared about his fate. He had died alone, not just physically, but administratively. A ghost in the system, mourned only by Maria, who had no official standing to demand answers. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Clipped to the government report was a handwritten note in Samuel's familiar script, apparently written before his final mission. Emergency instructions: if anything happens to me, please ensure Maria Santos, address below, is notified immediately. She is the only family I have now, the only person who will mourn if I don't come home. I've been estranged from my blood family for 5 years due to my own pride and stubbornness, but Maria has shown me that families can be chosen as well as born. If I die, I want her to know that the life we planned together was the closest I ever came to finding peace. The note was signed and dated February 21st, 1989, the day before Samuel's final flight. Elias read and reread the note until the words blurred together through his tears. Samuel had believed himself completely cut off from his family, had thought that his angry departure had severed all bonds of love and belonging. He had died thinking that no one in Lancaster County would care about his fate, never knowing that his brother had spent 40 years hoping for his return, praying for his safety, keeping a place in his heart that only Samuel could fill. The tragedy was complete now, perfect in its devastating symmetry. Two brothers who had loved each other despite their differences, both carrying regrets and longing for reconciliation, both too proud or too hurt to make the first move toward healing. Samuel had died within sight of home, carrying plans for return that would never be fulfilled. Elias had lived with guilt and grief that need never have existed. If only they had found a way to speak past their anger, to the love that had always remained beneath it. But perhaps the most heartbreaking realization was about Maria, this woman who had loved Samuel enough to search for him. who had been willing to help him rebuild his relationship with his family, who had waited faithfully for answers that never came. She was somewhere in the world, perhaps still wondering what had become of the man she had planned to marry. She deserved to know the truth, deserved to understand that Samuel's love for her had been real and lasting, worthy of the devotion she had shown in return. Elias clutched the documents to his chest, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around him like a mantle. This was bigger than his private grief, bigger than his fear of community judgment. Maria Santos had spent months searching these very woods for the man she loved, and somewhere in the world, she might still be waiting for answers only he could provide. Elias walked back to the farmhouse through deepening shadows, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd discovered. Maria's letter had changed everything. This was no longer just about his private grief or his family's buried secrets. Somewhere in the world, a woman who had loved Samuel deeply enough to spend months searching for him might still be waiting for answers, still carrying the weight of unresolved loss that Elias knew all too well. The farmhouse felt different when he entered, charged with new purpose, but also heavy with the magnitude of what he now understood he had to do. He spread Maria's letter, the government documents, and Samuel's journal across his kitchen table, studying them under the bright overhead light as if they were pieces of a puzzle that could somehow bring his brother back to life. The address Maria had left was in Norfolk, Virginia, a detail that made perfect sense given Samuel's military work. But the letter was dated 36 years ago. The chances of her still living at the same address, still carrying the same name, still reachable through conventional means, seemed impossibly slim. Yet the alternative, leaving her forever wondering what had become of the man she'd planned to marry, felt like a betrayal of everything Samuel had meant to both of them. Elias picked up his old rotary phone, then set it down again, his hands shaking with uncertainty. What would he say? How could he explain 4 decades of silence, 40 years during which Samuel's family had never once reached out to the woman who had clearly been the most important person in his brother's life? How could he justify keeping her in ignorance for so long about the fate of someone she had loved enough to search for? The enormity of the task ahead felt crushing. He would need to contact people he'd never met, navigate systems he didn't understand, possibly travel to places he'd never imagined visiting. At 72, the prospect of such upheaval felt overwhelming, but the alternative, living with the knowledge that Maria might still be waiting somewhere for answers he could provide, was unthinkable. A soft knock at his door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Through the window, he could see Martha's silhouette on his porch, but she wasn't alone. Lyddie stood beside her, still wearing the silver locket that had started this entire revelation, her small face pressed against the glass with curiosity. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," Martha said as he opened the door, but Lyddie was having trouble sleeping. "She keeps asking questions about the helicopter and the pretty lady in the picture. I thought maybe if she could see that you're all right—" "I can't sleep either, gross Dordie," Lyddie interrupted, her voice carrying the plaintive note of a child whose active imagination had been overloaded with new experiences. "I keep thinking about the flying machine. Was someone sad when they left it in the woods?" The question hit Elias with unexpected force. In her innocent way, Lyddie had identified the heart of the tragedy. Yes, someone had been very sad, and that sadness had echoed across decades, touching lives in ways that were only now becoming clear. "Yes, little bird," he said gently, kneeling down to her level. "Someone was very sad." Martha's eyes moved to the documents spread across his kitchen table, taking in the official letterhead and formal language visible even from a distance. Her expression shifted from concern to alarm as she recognized that whatever Elias had discovered was far more serious than old papers found in the woods. "Elias," she said quietly, "what exactly have you found?" The direct question hung between them, and Elias realized that his time for privacy and solitary grief had come to an end. The truth was too big, too complicated, and too important to carry alone. Martha had been a good friend to his family for years, had shown nothing but kindness and practical wisdom in all their interactions. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was someone who had demonstrated such loyalty to their community. "It's about my brother Samuel," he said finally, the words feeling strange after decades of avoiding the subject. "The journal belongs to him. The helicopter, he was the pilot." Martha's intake of breath was sharp and audible. Like everyone in their community, she knew the basic story of Samuel's departure, though she had never pressed for details. Her eyes moved from Elias's stricken face to the documents on the table, clearly trying to process the implications of what he'd revealed. "Samuel has been here all this time?" she whispered. "In your woods?" 36 years, Elias confirmed, his voice barely audible. "He died trying to come home, Martha. He was planning to return, to make amends for the harsh words between us. And I never knew. For 40 years I thought he'd simply chosen to forget us." Lyddie had wandered over to the table, drawn by the grown-up's serious conversation and the interesting papers spread across its surface. Her small fingers traced the edge of Maria's letter, her young mind working to make sense of the formal handwriting and official documents. "This lady wrote a letter," she observed, with the matter-of-fact tone children used for stating obvious truths. "It's a very long letter. She must have had important things to say." "Very important things," Elias agreed, watching as Lyddie's innocent presence somehow made the overwhelming situation feel more manageable. Children had a way of cutting through adult complications to focus on what truly mattered. Martha moved closer to the table, her eyes scanning Maria's letter with growing amazement. "She searched for him," she breathed. "This Maria, she actually came here looking for Samuel." "For months," Elias confirmed. "She drove every back road in Lancaster County, walked through woodlands just like ours. She was probably within miles of this spot dozens of times, never knowing how close she was to finding him. And she doesn't know what happened to him? As far as I can tell, she spent 36 years wondering. The government declared him dead, but never notified anyone because they had no record of family contacts. Samuel had listed her as his only emergency contact, but apparently that information was lost or ignored." Martha sank into a kitchen chair, the full weight of the tragedy settling over her. That poor woman. To love someone enough to search for them like that, and then to spend decades never knowing. "I have to find her," Elias interrupted, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "I have to tell her what happened to Samuel, let her know that her search wasn't in vain. But Elias, it's been 36 years. She could be anywhere, might not even be alive anymore. And even if you found her, what would you say? How do you explain why no one ever contacted her before now?" The practical questions Martha raised were valid, but they didn't diminish Elias's sense of obligation. Maria Santos had loved Samuel enough to dedicate months of her life to searching for him. She deserved to know that her faith had been justified, that Samuel had indeed been trying to come home to make peace with his family. She deserved to understand that his love for her had been real and lasting, documented in his own handwriting in the final days of his life. "I'll tell her the truth," Elias said simply, "that we were all too proud and stubborn to reach out when we should have, but that Samuel never stopped thinking about home, and he never stopped loving her." Lyddie had climbed onto a chair and was now studying the photograph in the locket with intense concentration. "She looks like someone who would give good hugs," she announced, with the grave authority of a 3-year-old expert on such matters. "I think she's probably very nice." "I think so too, sweetheart," Elias agreed, touched by the child's instinctive assessment. Samuel had chosen well in Maria Santos, the woman who had been willing to help him bridge the gap between his old life and his new one, who had seen past his anger and regret to the love that had always existed beneath. "There's something else you should know," Martha said quietly, her voice carrying a note of reluctance. "Word about your discovery is already spreading through the community. Jacob Miller was asking questions at the market today, and Bishop Weaver mentioned that he was concerned about you. People are starting to wonder what exactly you found in those woods." The news sent a chill through Elias's chest. He had hoped for more time to process Samuel's story privately, to figure out how to handle the complex emotions and logistics involved in contacting Maria. But their close-knit community's natural concern for its members meant that privacy was often a temporary luxury. "How long do you think I have before people start asking direct questions?" he asked. "Not long," Martha admitted. "Maybe a few days at most. Children talk, and Lyddie's been quite enthusiastic about sharing her adventure with anyone who will listen." Plus, Jacob recognized something familiar about the handwriting in that journal. He's been teaching Sunday school for 30 years. He has a good memory for penmanship. Elias felt the walls closing in around him, the careful isolation he'd maintained beginning to crumble under the weight of community attention. Soon he would have to face questions from people who had known and loved Samuel, who had prayed for his safe return for decades. They deserved to know the truth, but they also deserved to hear it from him rather than discovering it through gossip and speculation. "I need to call Sarah first," he said, thinking of his daughter in Ohio, who had never met her uncle, but who deserved to learn about Samuel's fate from her father rather than through community channels. "She has a right to know before anyone else. And then?" Martha prompted gently. "And then I find Maria Santos," Elias said with growing determination. "Before I tell anyone else in our community what happened to Samuel, I owe her the truth about the man she loved enough to search for." The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching the weight that had settled in Elias's chest since his sleepless night of wrestling with the magnitude of what he had to do. He stood at his kitchen window, watching the familiar rhythm of his neighbors beginning their daily routines, knowing that this might be one of the last mornings when his world felt manageable and contained. After Martha and Lyddie had departed the evening before, Lyddie still wearing the locket and chattering about the pretty lady who wrote letters, Elias had spent hours staring at his old rotary phone, trying to gather the courage to call his daughter Sarah in Ohio. The conversation he needed to have would change everything, not just for him, but for his entire family's understanding of their history. Finally, as the clock approached 8 in the morning, a reasonable hour to call, even with difficult news, he lifted the heavy receiver and dialed Sarah's number with trembling fingers. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried immediate concern when she heard his tone during their brief greeting. "You sound terrible." "Are you sick?" "Not sick, sweetheart," Elias said, settling heavily into his kitchen chair. "But I need to tell you something important. Something about your Uncle Samuel." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats. Sarah had heard stories about Samuel throughout her childhood, but they had always been delivered in the past tense, with the unspoken understanding that her uncle was a closed chapter in their family's history. "What about Uncle Samuel?" she asked carefully. "I found him, Sarah, yesterday while walking with little Lyddie Yoda. We discovered a crashed helicopter in our woods, and Samuel was the pilot. He's been there for 36 years. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other, as if speed might somehow make them easier to bear. On the other end of the line, he could hear Sarah's sharp intake of breath, could picture her sitting down heavily as the implications of his revelation sank in. "He's been on our property all this time?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Dad, are you certain it's him?" "I found his journal, sweetie. Pages and pages in his own handwriting, documenting the last years of his life. He was working for the government, flying reconnaissance missions, and he was planning to come home. He was going to make amends, try to rebuild the bridges he thought he'd burned." Sarah's silence stretched longer this time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "He wanted to come home?" "More than anything," Elias confirmed, his own voice breaking with the weight of that truth. "He wrote about missing our farm, about dreaming of seeing me working in the fields. He carried a photograph of our land in his wallet, Sarah. He never stopped thinking about us." "Oh, Dad." The pain in his daughter's voice cut through him like a blade. "All these years you've blamed yourself for the way he left. All those times you wondered if you could have handled things differently. I still wonder about that." Elias interrupted softly. We were both too proud, too stubborn. We let anger and misunderstanding keep us apart when we should have found a way to reach across the divide. But he was trying to come back, Sarah insisted with fierce determination. That has to count for something. That has to mean the love was stronger than the anger. Her words offered a small measure of comfort, but they also highlighted the magnitude of the task that lay ahead. There's more, Sarah. Samuel was engaged to marry a woman named Maria Santos. She searched for him after he disappeared, spent months driving through Lancaster County looking for any trace of him. As far as I know, she never learned what happened to him. 36 years, Sarah breathed. Dad, that woman has been wondering about Uncle Samuel for 36 years. I have to find her, Elias said, the words carrying more conviction than he felt. I have to tell her the truth about what happened to him, let her know that her search wasn't meaningless. How are you going to do that? She could be anywhere, could have married someone else, changed her name. I don't know, Elias admitted. But I have to try. Samuel loved her enough to list her as his only emergency contact, loved her enough to plan their future together right up until his final mission. She deserves to know that he died thinking about her, planning their life together. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Elias could almost hear her practical mind working through the logistics of what he was proposing. His daughter had inherited her mother's gift for organization and problem-solving, qualities that had served her well in her career as a school administrator. Dad, she said finally, I'm coming home. This is too big for you to handle alone, and Uncle Samuel was my family too, even if I never met him. We're going to find Maria Santos together. The offer of support nearly broke Elias's carefully maintained composure. He had expected Sarah to be shocked, confused, perhaps even angry that he'd kept such momentous news to himself for even one night. Instead, she was offering to drop everything and travel from Ohio to help him navigate the most difficult task of his life. You don't have to do that, sweetheart, he said, though the relief in his voice probably betrayed how desperately he wanted her support. Yes, I do, Sarah replied firmly. Uncle Samuel was planning to come home to family. Dad, the least we can do is make sure the woman he loved knows she was right to believe in him. 3 days later, Sarah arrived at the farm with a determination that reminded Elias powerfully of Ruth in her younger years. She had driven straight through from Ohio, stopping only for fuel and quick meals, her compact car loaded with manila folders, phone books, and what appeared to be a small computer. Technology that still mystified Elias, but which Sarah wielded with practiced efficiency. Show me everything, she said without preamble, setting her bags down in the kitchen and moving immediately to the table where Elias had kept Samuel's journal and Maria's letter carefully arranged. Her auburn hair, streaked with early grey at 45, caught the morning light as she bent over the documents with the focused intensity of someone solving a critical puzzle. Elias watched his daughter study Maria's letter, noting how her expression shifted from professional assessment to deep emotional investment as she absorbed the full scope of what Maria had endured. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but also blazing with purpose. Dad, this is incredible, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Look at this. She left not just her address, but detailed information about where she worked, her phone number, even the name of the church she attended. This woman wanted to be found, wanted anyone who might have information about Samuel to be able to reach her. But it's been 36 years, Elias protested, though hope was beginning to kindle in his chest, despite his attempts to remain realistic. The chances of any of that information still being current are better than you think, Sarah interrupted, pulling a thick phone book from one of her bags. I've been doing research since you called. Maria Santos isn't a common name, and Norfolk, Virginia isn't that large a city. Plus, I brought something that might help. She gestured toward the small computer she'd unpacked, its screen glowing with mysterious symbols and text. It's called the Internet, Dad. Libraries and universities have been using it for years to share information. If Maria Santos has left any trace of her life in public records, we might be able to find it." Elias stared at the device with deep skepticism. In his experience, the most important truths in life were found through personal connection, through sitting across from someone and looking into their eyes while you spoke. The idea that a machine could somehow locate a person across decades and vast distances seemed almost magical. "How does it work?" he asked, settling into the chair beside his daughter as she manipulated various buttons and switches. "It's like a giant library that connects computers all over the world," Sarah explained patiently, her fingers moving rapidly across a small keyboard. "People and organizations share information, and you can search through it using names, addresses, dates, all sorts of criteria." As they worked together throughout the morning, Elias found himself amazed by his daughter's persistence and ingenuity. She called information services, contacted government offices, even reached out to veterans organizations that might have records of people connected to Samuel's type of covert work. Each dead end seemed only to strengthen her resolve rather than discouraging her. "I found something," she announced suddenly, her voice tight with excitement. Around noon, she had been scrolling through what appeared to be a directory of some kind when her movements stopped abruptly. "Maria Santos, Norfolk, Virginia. There's a listing for a woman by that name who works at—" She paused, reading more carefully. "Dad, she works at a veterans counseling center. She spent her career helping military families." The information hit Elias like a revelation. Maria had devoted her professional life to supporting people whose loved ones served in dangerous, often secretive capacities. The choice seemed like both tribute and memorial to the man she'd lost, a way of honoring Samuel's sacrifice while helping others navigate the complexities of military life. "Is there a phone number?" he asked, though his hands had begun trembling at the prospect of actually making contact. "Yes, but Dad—" Sarah's voice carried a note of gentle warning. "We need to think carefully about how to approach this. Imagine receiving a phone call out of nowhere, 36 years after someone you loved disappeared. We could traumatize her if we handle this badly." The wisdom of her caution was obvious, but the knowledge that Maria Santos was still alive, still reachable, made waiting feel almost unbearable. For 3 days, Elias had been preparing himself for the likelihood that their search would end in disappointment, that too much time had passed for any meaningful connection to be possible. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Sarah had clearly been considering this question. "A letter first," she said firmly. "Something she can read privately, process on her own timeline. We'll include copies of Samuel's journal entries about her, about his plans to return home. We'll let her decide how much contact she wants after that." It was a thoughtful approach, respectful of Maria's emotional well-being, while still providing the answers she had been seeking for so long. Elias nodded his agreement, though the prospect of crafting such a letter felt overwhelming. "She'll help you write it," Sarah offered, seeing his uncertainty. "We'll do this together, Dad. Uncle Samuel deserves to have his story told with love and respect. And Maria Santos deserves to hear it the same way." 6 weeks later, Elias stood in his kitchen, watching through the window as an unfamiliar car turned into his driveway. His heart hammered against his ribs with a mixture of anticipation and terror that had been building for days. Since Maria Santos had called to say she was driving up from Virginia to meet the family of the man she had never stopped loving, the letter they had sent had been answered within a week, not with the formal response Elias had expected, but with pages of handwritten script that revealed a woman whose grief had been transformed over the decades into something approaching peace, but who had never stopped hoping for answers. "Dear Elias and Sarah," her response had begun. "I have read your letter dozens of times since it arrived, each reading bringing new tears, but also new comfort. To learn that Samuel was thinking of home, planning to return, planning to heal the relationships he thought he had, damaged beyond repair. This knowledge has been the answer to prayers I stopped believing would ever be answered. I want you to know that Samuel spoke of you constantly. Elias, he carried enormous guilt about the way he left, about the harsh words between you. He dreamed of the day he would have the courage to come home and ask for your forgiveness. In a way, learning the truth about his final flight brings us both a kind of peace. He was flying toward love, toward reconciliation, toward the family he never stopped missing. Now, as Maria Santos emerged from her car and stood for a moment looking at the farmhouse where Samuel had grown up, Elias felt the weight of 40 years of misunderstanding finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. She was older than the woman in the locket photograph, her dark hair now silver and her face lined with the kind of grief that never entirely fades. But her eyes held the same warmth and intelligence that had captured Samuel's heart decades ago. Sarah opened the door before Maria had finished walking up the path, and Elias watched as the two women embraced with the natural affection of people who had already shared their deepest sorrows through letters and phone calls. Lyddie bounced beside them, the silver locket still catching the light against her small chest, chattering excitedly about finally meeting the pretty lady from the picture. "You must be Elias," Maria said as she approached, and her voice carried the same gentleness he remembered from their phone conversations. She was smaller than he had expected, but she moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime helping others navigate their darkest moments. "I can't tell you what it means to finally meet Samuel's family," she continued, accepting his awkward embrace with genuine warmth. "He described you so often that I feel like I know you already." They gathered in the living room, where Ruth's photograph still held its place of honor on the mantel, and Maria studied the family pictures scattered throughout the space with the hungry attention of someone finally seeing the world her beloved had left behind. "He looks like you," she observed, pointing to a photograph of Samuel at 16. His young face bright with curiosity and barely contained energy. Same eyes, same stubborn chin. He used to joke that Stoltzfus men were built for hard work and harder thinking. The familiar joke, delivered in Maria's gentle voice, made Samuel feel present in a way that photographs and memories never could. Here was someone who had known him as an adult, who had shared his dreams and plans, who could speak of him with the intimate knowledge that only comes from deep love. "I brought something for you," Maria said, reaching into her purse to withdraw a small wooden box. "Samuel carved this for me during one of his longer deployments. He said it reminded him of the woodworking his father had taught him as a boy." Inside the box was a collection of letters Samuel had written to Maria over the years, along with the photograph of the Stoltzfus farm that he had carried in his wallet. The picture was worn soft from handling, creased at the edges from constant folding and unfolding. But it showed their property exactly as it still looked today. "He used to hold this picture when he was homesick," Maria explained, her voice thick with emotion. "He would tell me stories about every building, every field, every tree line. He made me fall in love with this place before I ever saw it." As the afternoon progressed, they walked together to the woodland where Samuel's helicopter rested beneath its blanket of vines and moss. Maria stood quietly beside the wreckage for a long time, one hand resting on the metal that had been Samuel's final resting place, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer or perhaps final words to the man she had never stopped loving. "He made it home," she said finally, turning to face Elias with tears streaming down her face, but also with something approaching smile. "Maybe not the way he planned, but he made it back to the place he loved most. He was trying to reach you, Elias, even in his final moments. He was trying to come home." Lyddie had insisted on giving Maria the locket, declaring with 3-year-old certainty that it belongs to the lady in the picture. Maria had accepted the gift with tears, fastening the chain around her own neck, where it seemed to catch and hold the last rays of afternoon sunlight. As evening approached and it came time for Maria to begin her drive back to Virginia, she embraced each of them with the fierce affection of someone who had found the missing pieces of her heart after decades of searching. Samuel would be so happy to know his family and his Maria finally found each other. Sarah observed as they watched her car disappear down the country road. Yes, Elias agreed, feeling a peace settle into his chest that he hadn't experienced since before Samuel's angry departure 40 years ago. I think he would be. The secrets were finally at rest, the questions answered, the love acknowledged that had never truly died despite years of silence and misunderstanding. Samuel was home at last, surrounded by people who understood the true measure of his heart.